The V&T was responsible for the industrial development of this corner of Nevada. So railroads represented the first industrialization and the first modernization to arrive in this corner of Nevada. The first railroad in Nevada was the Central Pacific, the western portion of the very first transcontinental railroad on the North American continent. And it was built in 1869. The reason for building to this location actually was to take advantage of the opportunity to ship goods to and from and transport people who were headed to the Comstock lode at Virginia City. Of course, everyone in the country is familiar with the gold rush to California after gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in the 1840s. And so, of course, that's only a couple of hundred miles immediately west of here, although there's a huge mountain range between here and there. So a lot of the people who'd gone to California for the gold rush, when the Comstock lode was discovered a decade later in 1859, they came over here and tried again. So the busiest period on the Comstock, really there were two of them, the initial rush, and then things were gradually tapering off, and it was clear that one way to revive the mines would be by lowering some of the costs of doing business. And that's where the decision to build the Virginia and Truckee came from. The major railroads, the trunk line railroads that operate in farming country, because agriculture is an economically sustainable activity, are perfectly willing to build branch lines into small towns that are off of their main lines. But the mining industry is different because an ore deposit is of unknown extent, but it's obviously finite. It's going to, one day there will be no more ore, at least none that's profitable to take out of the ground. And so at that point, the trunk line railroads, recognizing this, said to the mining companies, if you'd like rail transportation, build a short line railroad that belongs to you and connect it to our tracks. And so the result here in Nevada is that we have a relatively large number of short line railroads. The best known is the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. The V&T was built just after the Central Pacific reached Reno, 1869, 1870. The V&T's main mission was to transport ore from Virginia City down to the valley of the Carson River, and then it runs north to Reno to make a connection with the trunk line railroad that was the pathway to the outside world. And a series of small railroads were built all the way south to that central part of the state to provide rail transportation for people coming in to work in the mines, for manufactured goods being sent in for their use, and also for the finished product, the finished mineral product coming out. The Comstock started with gold, but it's best known for its production of silver. And the prime period for the production of minerals, when most of the wealth came out of the ground, was the last 5 or 6 years in the midst of the 1870s. It was basically all over by 1880, and it took another decade or so for the realization to sink in that the mines probably weren't going to come back in anything like their previous glory. It didn't look very promising in the 1890s, so the railroad, the V&T, was casting around for some other way to improve its fortunes. And it got together with a family that was in the land and cattle business in the Carson Valley, just north of Gardnerville. And this family, named Dangberg, offered land for a right-of-way free of charge if the railroad would build the 15, 16 miles south from Carson City to their new town site of Minden, Nevada. And in 1906, that was done. And for about 15 years thereafter, the V&T was economically rejuvenated by the agricultural traffic that had moved. Here in the West, if you raise sheep, you need to get them up on summer range in the high mountains. And they'd graze up there for the summer and then be transported back. Now this was kind of an involved operation. And so after World War I, the United States government discovered that it had a lot of surplus construction equipment. You know, everything from picks and shovels to scrapers and graders, and these were all things that were getting ready to go to Europe to aid the American effort, the American war effort in France. And of course, because the war ended abruptly while we were still mobilizing, a lot of this stuff had never been used. So the US government decided to give this material and some cash with which to buy cement to make concrete to the various states if the states would organize highway departments, which Nevada was glad to do. So suddenly in the 1920s, very, very rapidly, and with subsidy from the US government, the road network in rural America was being tremendously improved. And among the very first forms of short line railroad traffic to disappear and move to the highways were things like the movement of animals and also carrying people for comparatively short distances. As the traffic base for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad diminished, one of the things that it was doing, one of the sources of revenue it had, was bringing in petroleum products that were going to be used to some extent in farm machinery, but especially in automobiles and trucks. So gasoline. So it was really this conversion that was the last source of traffic for the V&T. So that's one aspect of the story. But as far as the V&T specifically is concerned, in 1938, when the line to Virginia City went out of business, the V&T was able to sell a large number of its old locomotives and freight and passenger cars to Paramount Pictures for the use in Cecil B. DeMille's motion picture Union Pacific, which came out the following year. And that sort of set a pattern. Evidently, Western movies were very popular in the late 1930s, and all of the studios were making them. So MGM and 20th Century Fox, as well as Paramount, bought equipment from the V&T. And it's the interest of the motion picture industry, plus the survival of some of these locomotives in secondary uses at quarries or lumbering operations in the mountains, that caused these locomotives to survive. The strength of the Nevada State Railroad Museum among railroad museums is the fact that this collection represents examples of 19th century railroad technology. This is a McKean car. It's the only fully restored McKean car that looks just the way it did when it was built. There were about 130 of these constructed between 1905 and the late 1920s, and this one is the only surviving example that's completely intact and restored to the way it looked when it was new. This car runs for the general public just a handful of times a year. And today we have a group called the Lionel Operating Train Society that's having its national meeting in Sparks, Nevada. They'll be down here, 150 of them this morning, to ride the McKean car and see the museum. Behind me is perhaps our most important artifact, the Virginia and Truckee locomotive Inyo, built for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Built in 1875. And it's been restored to not its original appearance, but its appearance in the early 1880s after it received air brakes for the first time. There are 9 surviving V&T locomotives. One's in private ownership in Arizona. The state of Nevada owns 4 of them. 3 are here in Carson City. The 4th locomotive is in Virginia City at the Comstock History Center. The state of California owns 3 V&T locomotives, and the 8th one is at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. It's been said that modern-day Nevada owes as much to its railroads as it does to its mines, because without the railroads, mining on an industrial scale, the way we had it in Nevada, would never have taken place.